Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be the moderator for this opening session. I think Christopher has very well highlighted the objectives for today's discussion, and we felt that we should start by trying to get the global picture about the way the relationship between business and civil society has been evolving. In a way, the question for our first session is how to rethink, and should we rethink, the relationship between business and civil society organization. We all know that this relationship has gone through multiple phases, from outward, let's say, antagonism, or at least suspicion, to now a mode of awkward, sometimes more efficient collaboration. But is it time now, at this stage of maturation of the process, to rethink the rules of engagement? How to make sure that business organization and civil society organization, which don't share the same philosophy, which don't have the same modus operandi, which don't necessarily see eye to eye with respect to some objectives that they are pursuing, that these two entities, if you want, might collaborate efficiently and might create the conditions of transparency and legitimacy that would enable a more efficient collaboration. And these are the kind of issues that we want to address over the next 90 minutes. And for this purpose, let me introduce our panelists. First of all, we have Serena, who is the Global Development Initiative Senior Manager at KPMG, one of the key consulting companies in the world. Then we have Rodrigo Jordan. Many of you know him well. He has been with us already previously. He's a Mountaineer, but he is also the president of Vertical SA. He comes from Chile. Then we have Marlene Tadros. She is the founding president and executive director of Virtual Activism and professor of computer science at the New England Institute in Boston. Then we have Professor Nicolas Michel. Again, many of you know him from his previous participations. And he is a professor of international law at the University of Geneva and also at the Geneva Institute for International and Development Studies. Last but not least, to my extreme left, is Danny Sriskandarajah, and he's coming from South Africa, and he's the Secretary General of the World Alliance for Civic Participation. So this is our panelists. These are your interlocutors for this first discussion. And I would like to turn to you first, Serena, because I have been very succinctly describing the kind of phases in the relationship between business organization and NGOs. And I would like to ask you, in a way, to describe how you have seen the evolution of this relationship. Where do you think it is moving? And if you could give some examples of efficient collaboration, and tell us maybe why this example of collaboration have been successful. What lessons can we draw from that? Serena.
Thank you very much, Claude, and good morning, everyone. It's a real privilege to be in this incredible location, but I think more importantly, a perfect time, because we are seeing a rapid and vital evolution in the relationship between civil society and business, and I think one that is very long overdue. At Davos, KPMG launched a report called The Future of Civil Society, which we produced with World Economic Forum. It synthesized the views of over 200 leaders from civil society, business and government, and perhaps many of you, as well as research that had been undertaken by organizations like Civicus. And what we found was that civil society is very diverse, vibrant, and influential, and that the traditional roles of civil society are blurring with those of other stakeholders. And so civil society should no longer be seen as a third sector, but as the glue between the private and the public sectors that binds them together to make them work better for the common good. And so I think there are two main ways in which I see this evolution playing out. Firstly, for the first time, business is really at the table together with civil society and government in global governance processes. So, for example, I've just left at my desk KPMG's views on the Sustainable Development Goals. Business wasn't involved in shaping the Millennium Development Goals, but this time round, we're very much at the table. We had good presence at Rio Plus 20, and Paul Polman, Unilever's chief executive, was appointed to the high-level panel of preeminent persons and led a consultation with businesses representing 10% of global GDP. So I think that really demonstrates that these issues really do matter to business, and we believe that we have a vital and distinct role to play. And the second part of that, which obviously goes alongside it, is that instead now as civil society coming to us and asking us to do something quite specific, typically to help them be more effective and efficient in their projects, we're actually sitting together with civil society to co-create solutions as well as then jointly implement them to some of the world's biggest challenges. I think it's appropriate in Switzerland perhaps to focus on financial services, and I think insurance is one of the industries that's not yet receiving the level of attention that's commensurate with its enormous potential role in society. Obviously, they have long-term assets that need to back their long-term insurance liabilities, and therefore a huge source of patient capital for development projects. Their role in pricing risk is essential to drive the right decisions, but also to produce innovative projects that can serve those who are most vulnerable and least able to cope with shocks and hazards, things like microinsurance. So Swiss Re estimates that microinsurance is a potential market of $40 billion a year in annual turnover, and it's only at 2 to 3% market penetration. And what we see is a number of really fantastic pilots, but it's not yet going to scale. So at the moment, I'm going to give an example of a pilot. There's one between the NGO Mercy Corps, Swiss Re, and Fonkosi, which is the biggest microfinance institution in Haiti, that's providing credit insurance, which mean it's a weather index cover, so that businesses, when they're affected by climatic conditions, get a quick payout that enables their loan to be repaid, but also to give them working capital to set up again. So I think that's just one example. Swiss Re making huge extra investment in order to look at how to extend it to other risks and other geographies, and also seed funding from DFID. So I think that's one example of the small scale, the kind of ways that we need to come together to get proof of concept so things can then get to scale. But also, much more importantly than that, you have more global initiatives like the Scaling Up Nutrition Program, Education for All, which are taking a more systematic approach.
Thank you. Back to my question. In the case of initiatives that you have mentioned, could you identify one or two key conditions for success?
Mm-hmm. Partnership takes time, and it's getting the balance between being sufficiently impatient to get the urgency to make things happen, but also taking time to understand each other and have a frank exchange of objectives, not being shy that ultimately business is looking to make a profit, but hopefully in a way that creates shared value. So I think investing in the process of building partnerships is really, really critical, and taking time to build that trust.
Thank you. We will get back to some of the points you have raised. Let me turn to you, Rodrigo. In fact, you have been very much involved in business and also in NGO activity. And we have mentioned that, of course, we have gone through different phases. At the same time, we see that there are still some issues which are making still sometimes the relationship problematic. Is it time to rethink the terms of engagement between business and civil society? Is it time to try to look for a greater alignment between the two?
Let me start by thanking you and of course the organizers. It's a pleasure being up here again. I've been part of the Zermatt Summit for the 4 times it has run. You're right, I've been involved in the world of business and the civil society and the social issues. Sometimes that gets complicated because it's really hard to describe what you do. My daughters at school, when asked what does your father do, they never know how to answer because, you know, and there is a crucial thing there because people tend to see this thing as separate. You know, that there is business and there is NGOs, and they might relate, but they don't work together. Let me tell you a story. You were mentioning Haiti. In 2010, as you know, I'm a climber, we were about to leave for a big expedition in the Himalayas to a sacred peak, and everything was ready. It had taken 2 years for us to put that expedition together. And just literally 2 weeks before we were leaving, we had this huge earthquake in Chile that came 2 months just after the one in Haiti. We didn't have as much deaths as in Haiti, but we did have a lot of destruction, especially in housing for the poor. And so my group of climbers, being themselves working people in business, they work in banks, they work in engineering companies, you know, we canceled the expedition and literally got all our things into the pickup trucks and went down there to work with the families that have been affected. They were homeless, of course. I've been summoned to this Zermatt Summit as an expert. I'm not an expert in anything, save in putting up tents. I know how to put up tents. I've been doing that for 20 years now, so that I know. And putting up tents was very crucial in this case because that's what people needed. So we worked in the emergency for about 2 weeks, and everything was back into the very basics of living, and start thinking in the process of reconstruction is going to take 2 years and still going on. And so we were about to leave back to Santiago, and the ladies running these camps said, "You can't go back." And we say in Spanish, Don Rodrigo, you can't go back. So why not? No, because you need to stay with us. Because you've been with us, you've accompanied us. It's not that you have given us anything, because we didn't have anything to give. We have with them, we have helped them, and we want you to stay back. We said, but there's nothing else we can do. Yes, you can stay with us and just be with us. So we decided to stay for another couple of weeks, and then we helped building up the emergency shelters that were coming in. And then after a month, they said, look, we need to go back now because we're all working people. We need to go back to our jobs. No, you can't go. You need to stay with us. To make a long story short, we stayed for 18 months working with 220 families. But the most important thing that happened, at least as in my way as I see it, is my fellow climbers who had never been really involved in social working, that they were doing or climbing or working, as I say, in companies. They come to me and they said, look, Rodrigo, there's something that really transformed my way of seeing poverty issues, is that poor people do have a lot of resources. So I said, what do you mean? I said, yes, because they relate to each other. They know very quickly how to build a team around some emergency, and they can cook together. They can, they have capital, human capital resources. They have knowledge. These mainly we're working families that are craftsmen fisheries, by the coast. And so they know how to fish much more than we do, They have a lot of knowledge. They have some capital. They have their boats, the engines. So one of them was saying, I came down here to help the poor. You know, I was the capable, the rich, the knowledgeable, and I was coming down here to help the poor who didn't know. And I now realize that they know as much as we do in a different way. They have these resources. And I think, to me, what happened there is something crucial that needs to happen between these two organizations, the NGOs and the business, is that we approach things, both of us, and I mean NGOs and business, to whatever the purpose is, the common purpose, fixing climate change, addressing the poor in a certain specific territory, or doing, some virtual campaignings or everything. We approach this, and I think the word I use is unconsciously arrogant. Because these are all good people, they want to do things, they want to do it the best they can. But in some way in the back of their mind, I've studied in a good school, I went to a good university, I have education, and I know how to deal with this. And so I'm going to go and help. And when I talk to business people, they say, well, but this is very easy to solve. We need to put electricity in this camp up there in the desert in the northern part of Chile. This is very easy to do. Whoa. We need to talk to the people. You go to the NGOs, and the NGOs will tell you the same thing. No, business people don't know anything. We know the people. They don't. Many of the NGOs have never been in the places where you need to be. And so I think there's two new elements that need to be addressed. Is, first of all, really identify the purpose of our work. And Christopher was bringing us putting the human being back at the center of our activities. And I think we need to discuss a lot, business themselves, NGOs themselves, and together, what is their purpose? And if that purpose is there, then jointly address this unconscious arrogance, I think. And be opened up to hear and to sit there and to, I need to understand how business works and how they do work. They have their own system. And I am a businessman, I need to talk to the NGOs and see how they work, how they think. And I need to be open. And I entirely agree with Serena, that takes time. And I think we both need to invest time. Maybe we're not going to not hurry into solving the situation. Invest time in understanding each other and hearing each other and putting up. And the way of doing this, I'm sorry, I'm going to end with this. But the way of doing this is to consciously be humble. To make the effort of being humble, because I'm not going to be arrogant, okay. And then you sit back there and you hear, no, you need to actively be humble and say, okay, I'm going to hear. So to combat unconscious arrogance, you need to be consciously humble. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo. I think you gave a very good segue to my next point with Professor Michel, because you mentioned the common purpose, the common objectives that NGOs and business should pursue. But at the same time, these common objectives, this common purpose, they cannot be set in a kind of vacuum, because after all, there is a third actor, the state, the public sector, the government. And of course, the government, politicians, are elected in a way to set the direction and to set in a way and to help identify what should be the common purpose, the common objective toward which policies should be implemented, toward which the forces, whether at the national or international level, should be mobilized. And so, in a way, Professor Michel, my question to you is, we have seen the role of the state in designing, identifying this common objective, this common purpose. This role has also been tremendously evolving, because in a way, many of the mission of the states have changed, and the environment in which the state operates has also changed. So what is, in a way, the new paradigm for government, for the public sector, in terms of identifying this common purpose, these common goals toward which society and the international community should be aiming at?
Thank you so very much. And you're right in saying that the previous speakers, as well as Christopher, set the stage in a wonderful way. In fact, your introduction was exactly to the point and exactly where I wanted to start. It is true that the role of the state and states in general has changed in the past 20, 30 years in a tremendous way in the international community, and even more than that. I mean, the nature of the international community that was considered to consist mainly of a community of sovereign states until rather recently, where the main actor, if not the exclusive actor, was the state. And the past 20 years, we have seen this old model really, break down, but because of the circumstances, because of interdependencies, and also because of the vision of some leaders, to the point that one can say that the international legal order is no longer focused essentially on the law of relations between states, but really on the law of the international community with actors like the individual human being, and this is completely new, civil society, and the private sector. And in that context, the role of the state, it seems to me, can be defined in at least three aspects. The first one is to set the overall objectives, it seems to me, in terms of, one, promoting the common good, the universal common good. There is, of course, a common good at the national level, one at the level of the world community, and the really end purpose also of promoting the common good is to promote the human dignity, the dignity of each and every individual human being. This is the criteria for the success of a well-promoted common good. Now, the common good at the international level encompasses, of course, a number of objectives, but here we could summarize and indicate three of them as main titles, if you want, subjects. Like the first one would be peace and security. Second one would be development, I mean well-being of people with all the elements that we know, food, health, education, etc. And the third one being, you will understand that I insist on that as a lawyer, but I think that the role of law has to be understood in an international community. So the importance of the rule of law, participation, democratic legitimization of the rules, of the fundamental rules, and eventually the human rights that are of interest and relevance not only for states, but definitely also for business, but in a way that has to be defined. Now, let us be very concrete. I could give a number of examples. I'm going to take examples taken out of my experience in the international community. As you know, I had the privilege of working for the United Nations, but I could also take examples of the relationship between states and civil society. In a way, states had to learn to work with civil society even before business had to do it. And I could give the example of the way in which the Rome Statute establishing the International Criminal Court was negotiated in Rome, where a powerful civil society was present and requested the state delegations negotiating the treaty to include representatives of the civil society. Now, this is, of course, very challenging for both, because if a representative of civil society is a member of an official delegation, he or she has to recognize that his or her role changes. So there's danger for both, I mean, for the state and for civil society. But I'm not going to develop that aspect because we'll focus more on business and civil society. Example number one, I would mention that is a good example, but partly controversial, the so-called Kimberley process on, this is an initiative taken jointly by governments, private sector, and NGOs on stemming the flow of conflict diamonds. As we know, so-called blood diamonds played an essential role in funding conflicts, armed conflicts, and military groups. And that became a problem because civil society was criticizing the private sector for selling diamonds that were, acquired under very doubtful circumstances. So there the process was established, and at the end, kind of a consensus was adopted, but I know that not everyone is absolutely pleased with the way in which the process is being implemented. There are interesting lessons to be drawn. Another example that seems to me to be interesting is the one relating to private military and security companies. Now there is kind of a privatization of violence, of the use of force, if you want, and as it appeared, for instance, in Iraq, when a number of states resorted not to their military, but to private companies in order to protect their embassies. And more than that, even with combat missions. So what happens with respect for international humanitarian law and human rights when those fighting are private actors? So there was definitely a need to define the legitimacy of the existence of such companies and their behavior. And here both Switzerland and the International Committee of the Red Cross set in motion an initiative cooperating with the civil society as well as academia that led to the adoption of the so-called Montreux document in 2008. But this is emblematic in the way in which these days international law develops. If you wanted to have today states gather in order to adopt the 4 Geneva Conventions, it would never work. It's no longer possible to do it that way. So what happens is that you start with a group of like-minded states, with the private sector when it is interested, with civil society. You focus on a limited but vital segment where you want to reach progress. You do it. You adopt a soft law document, hoping that at the end it will become hard law. So that's the way things evolve in this context of cooperation. I don't want to be too long, and for the sake of discussion, I mentioned the example of the Global Compact, and I could mention also another experience that I was privileged to do when I was working for the Swiss government. You know that Switzerland, for reasons we know all too well, had to freeze ill-gotten assets that were located in Switzerland and coming from developing countries. And Switzerland, because of the circumstances, did play a pioneer role in the restitution of these ill-gotten assets. Now, how do you do when you give back money to a government that is as corrupt as the previous regime? So it continues like this. So one of the best things to do is to set up a mechanism where you associate the government, international NGOs and others, for instance, to invest the money in a public interest project in a country, hospitals, roads, schools, etc. And here you have the cooperation of business, possibly also, in order to better protect the common good. So these were the examples I want to make.
Thank you very much for bringing this dimension to our discussion. Let me now bring another dimension to this discussion with you, Marlene, because what we have seen in the last few years is really the spectacular explosion of the social media. And I have to say that maybe NGOs have been the most efficient players in the world in terms of knowing how to leverage the mobilizing power of social media. And we have seen that not only in developed countries, but when you look at what is happening, for instance, in China, it is absolutely staggering. And so, in a way, this emergence, this explosion of social media, its role, all the blogs, the Weibo in China, and so on and so forth, has in a way changed the rules of engagement, has given civil society a clout that it never had before. And so how is it changing the relationship? And in a way, toward which kind of situation are we evolving as we see no end, in a way, to the reach and clout of social media?
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here. I have to say that I speak in 2 hats. One is the American, where I live now and work, and one is the Egyptian, from where I've come, worked all my life. I'm just a recent arrival in the United States. So I kind of see the influence of social media. I also see the influence of business. So I have that dimension. So I'll speak both, all right? Social media changed the, what we call, it inverted the pyramid. People had businesses, basically, were very influential. There's this product, we sell it, or this service that we do, and we make money, and we go home. Sometimes we go and do some good work and some charity, and go to poor places with that arrogance you were talking about. The problem now is that these influencers, and they are influencers, have been inverted. In what way? The people have more say now. And it's not that money talks anymore. It's not business. It's not that aspect of it. It is really civil society has the say in a lot of things that are happening now. So I'll give you some examples. One example is recently a retailer, a very famous retailer in the United States. The CEO said something very demeaning. He said, I only would like to sell to beautiful people. And I'm sure a lot of you heard about that. And of course, social media took it up immediately. And it affected that business very negatively, because now you don't have just this company that's selling things and saying those absurd comments, no matter how their product is great, but it was taken up by social media, and people started to not only bash him, but they also started giving away the clothes that they had. And he had to recant, and he had to have a whole PR campaign to explain it. So the people cannot be ignored anymore. Civil society cannot be ignored anymore, because they have become the influencers. Today, if I don't like a business, I'm going to write a blog about it. I'm going to, and publishing on the internet, there's nothing easier. And you can say, well, there is a question of credibility. It's true, but still, it depends on the influencers and how many people I'm influencing around me. Now, these are the simple examples. I can give you other examples, like McDonald's, for example. They went online and decided to do this great campaign, which is, it was a Twitter campaign, and they said, use this hashtag. I don't know how many of you use Twitter, but they said, use this hashtag and tell us how great McDonald's is. And of course, people went there. That was a huge mistake. You don't do that, especially with that reputation of giving this kind of food. So people bashed it, and they had to take all this back. Now, this is the relatively harmless side of things. But I can tell you that there are more powerful and more harmful things that are being done. Meaning, yes, civil society has this capability, but there are other actors, like Mr. Nicolas was saying, the state also, and it encourages some of this. So part of what I do in virtual activism is I give training about technology to other civil society actors in the Middle East in particular, and elsewhere, but mostly in the Middle East. And I remember the most recent one was in December, and it was in Syria, actually on the border, at a refugee camp. And they were asking me, okay, what are the best technologies? We use Skype, so do you think it's safe? and we communicate via Skype. And of course, this is a life and death matter now. So I had to call my colleagues just to make sure. I said, I think nothing is safe, but I will call my colleagues and ask. And I asked, and they said, oh, no, it's 64-bit encryption, it's perfect, they can use Skype. Okay, now I go back home after a while, and then I discovered that, no, actually, it's not safe. Why is it not safe? Well, because there are companies that are selling surveillance technologies, some of which are known as deep packet inspection, that will go beyond any of these, even the encryption. And we can scream from here till tomorrow and say, well, this is because we have terrorists, this is because of safety. It really isn't just about that. We are also jeopardizing human rights activists. We are also jeopardizing civil society. We are jeopardizing human rights. You should know, perhaps, that one of the it's actually the second largest industry in the United States, after the arms industry, is the surveillance industry. And by surveillance, that is, there are companies that are selling surveillance technologies to all of these repressive regimes. It's not about terrorism. They are selling it to repressive regimes. We have companies, again, last year in one of our demonstrations in Egypt, so they were throwing at us tear gas, and then here's where social media comes in. People started taking photos of these, of the spent tear gas canisters, and it showed the name of the company. We traced it back to a company that's in the US that is called, of course, remember there are people on the ground and there are others who are on Twitter and there are others on blogs, and we're all doing our duty, right? We're all passing the information around. Okay, who sells this kind of canister? And then we discovered that it's this American company that is selling this. Now, some of this stuff is being sold, and here's why a lot of civil society people really don't trust business. And it is a question of trust. That we think in many ways that profit trumps dignity, human dignity, and human rights. And I find that a very disturbing ethical issue. If this is the second largest industry, we've seen cases of, you have the first largest industry selling weapons to regimes, and then you have the second largest industry, which is selling surveillance technologies to both the government as well as to, but mostly to governments, as well as civil society has the use of some of those. So it's rather disturbing. By the way, the US is not the only culprit. There's an Amnesty report. And here's another thing about social media. There's an Amnesty report that says from 2001 or 2002 that actually said, here's what's happening. These people are selling, these companies from the UK, from France, from Denmark, for God's sake, they're selling these types of equipment. Now, these types of equipment include torture equipment. So on the one hand, we find these governments are calling for democracies and, saying we want democracy and you're not democratic. And then on the other, we find these companies that are actually selling torture equipment. And not only that, and training as well. So again, social media, yes, the report was from 2001. Guess what? Social media is what picked it up. Social media is what's, I mean, the report was there. We did not do anything with the report except when social media really came about, because now we all know about it. Anybody who doesn't know about it is because they're deliberately not knowing about it. So I think business now has no choice but to be ethical, because in one case, at least with one French company, it was actually closed down. Another UK company that was selling to the Saudis some arms deal closed down because social media picked it up and bashed them big time. So it's, I just want to put it this way. Civil society, you know, we keep saying it's a relationship between civil society and business. Well, actually, I think business is the person, and we all know, I think, that businesses are now corporations. Corporations are humans, right? They're treated as human in the law. In Egypt as well, by the way. Okay, so if we consider business the human, I think that civil society is the conscience of that human. And you cannot live without a conscience and a soul. And that's my talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Marlene, for bringing that dimension. Maybe to complement what you have been saying, and this kind of ambivalence with respect to the use of social media and the way it can be used as a surveillance tool. If you take China, for instance, in China today, there are 2 million people employed full-time to monitor social media. At the same time, in China today, on a 24-hour basis, at any moment of the day, there are 350 million people using social media. And we have seen that in China today, on the one hand, the state controls and have surveillance on the social media. At the same time, it has become the greatest and most powerful tool for the people to have their voice heard. For the first time over the last few years, we have seen major projects which have had to be stopped or aborted because social media has mobilized the people. Just an example, the second line of a super speed train in Shanghai. Or another example, you all have seen, or maybe you have heard, that at the last National People's Congress, somebody took picture of the wrists of the senior officials, high dignitaries who were attending the National People's Congress. And then on social media you saw, oh, this is a Audemars Piguet watch, which is 50,000 Swiss francs, and how come Mr. Wang Zhu, with his salary, can afford a 50,000 francs watch? And all of a sudden, there was a terrible, from the government, clampdown on this kind of corruption. And by the way, the luxury watch industry, Swiss watch industry, is suffering terribly with a drop of sales in China today. So we see this kind of ambivalence that it is a tool that can be used by government, that can be used as a leverage by the civil society, and this is this kind of cat and mouse play between the actors using the social media. So I think this is a dimension that we should keep in mind, that of course we have seen the role of social media during the uprising in Egypt as an example, and you mentioned Syria. Now, let me turn to you, Dani Sriskanga Daraja, and in fact, you are a leader of an NGO. You have been listening to what has been said so far, and I would like first that you react to what you have heard, and then I would like to ask you, and we heard also some of the problem, but I would like to ask you from a very, I would say, on-the-ground point of view, what are the key obstacles, what are the friction points that you encounter almost on a daily basis in your activities when you are dealing with government, when you are dealing as an NGO with the other players? So, Dani, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'd like to add my thanks for the invitation to be here. I almost didn't come because I was told not to by my communications director back at Civicus in Johannesburg. So I've started this job as heading up a global alliance. We're an NGO, but we're also an alliance with members, civil society members in over 100 countries. And my comms director, when I told him I'm coming, he said, no, I really don't think you should go. Because when I started in January, I went to Davos, and since then I've been invited to lots of these high-level forums where I've been talking to business. And I said to the comms director, why don't you want me to go? And he says, well, it will look very bad amongst our members if they keep seeing you turning up to these Swiss resorts, talking to businesses. And to me, the reason he was saying that is because I think outside this room, particularly amongst the membership that I represent, there is huge distrust. There is distrust that there may well be the progressive tip of the business iceberg, people like you who are representing sort of, let's say, enlightened business who want to have a conversation about sustainability or social responsibility. But for many of our members, the reality is very different. But I did come because I'm fascinated by this interface between business and NGOs, or business and civil society. I think it's one of the most exciting, perhaps unpredictable interfaces in the way that the world is changing these days. And the more we talk about it, I think the more likely we are to manage that process for the better good. I do see, and I've heard a little bit today already, that a lot of cross-dressing. For those of you I lived in the UK for 15 years, where it's a national hobby to cross-dress. Men love to dress up as women. But I sense now that it's getting very difficult sometimes to tell who is a business leader and who is an NGO leader. And it's because the language we use, the approach we take, the model that we're adopting becomes very difficult to distinguish. I mean, if you take some of the world's largest NGOs, World Vision International, for example, is run by Kevin Jenkins, who used to run a major airline before he arrived at World Vision. In the country where I now live, in South Africa, there probably isn't a single big business that isn't run by someone who was previously in civil society. It's activists in South Africa who are now running big businesses. And even if you take the sort of impact of what's going on, let me be sort of just between us say that there are probably businesses in this world who do more to improve the lives of people, particularly in poor countries, than some of our biggest NGOs. Because these guys are delivering effective services at very subsidized or cost-effective prices. But on the other hand, there are some big NGOs that probably have brand value and business models that would make a lot of business leaders jealous. They wish they could have that sort of credibility. So there is, I think, that's a very long way of saying I think this is a timely conversation, and I'm looking forward to these 2 days. To your question, Claude, I think my sort of biggest observation about what's going on the ground is there's a confusion about where and when business NGO relationships are productive and worth pursuing. And because I think there is if you take civil society in all of its glory, in a very simple mind, I like to sort of think in very simple ways, civil society to me starts with basic citizenship, that all of us in this room are members of civil society in one sense because we belong to church groups, we belong to volunteering organizations, we do stuff to build our communities. Then we move across the spectrum into service delivery, where a lot of us recognize there are things that are wrong in this world and we want to help. So we start an NGO to provide services or do this or that. Then we move across into advocacy because when you provide all these services, you soon realize, well, why? Hold on a minute. Why is my NGO having to do this? Why is the state not delivering? Or why is this organization or that organization? You get into this sort of advocacy space. And before too long, at the other end of the spectrum, where civil society and sort of social mobilization that Marilyn is talking about, is the sort of political change, the edgy end of civil society, where people are advocating, agitating for social change. Now, if you look across that spectrum, the interesting question for me, which I hear a lot, is, well, where and when along that spectrum is the collaboration between business and NGO most effective? I think, if in terms of active citizenship, probably across the world, some of the sort of the best citizenship programs are usually sponsored by local businesses. I mean, it's, the Scout group is sponsored by the local butcher or whatever else it is, and that's sort of good stuff that needs to keep going. When you get into service delivery, especially in the West, in developing countries, but also increasingly in developed countries, but increasingly in developing countries, this is where it gets really challenging, because with the withdrawal of the state, as Nicolas has started to sort of talk about, there's a vacuum. Someone has to deliver the employment services or the welfare services or whatever else it is. Who does this? In many countries in the West, this is being gobbled up by large private sector interests. I mean, in the UK, we've seen the employment program, the work placement program, being sort of sucked up by large business organizations. But who are they working with to deliver those programs? Often, it's NGOs. And this is where the sort of real crux of the mistrust, the power imbalance, the difference in approach, the difference in accountability mechanisms start to really sort of be exposed, and where there are some really important conversations to be had. But then if you get to the sort of the edgier bit of the spectrum, you get to a different set of challenges. And this is where, again, after a few months in South Africa, a lot of my South African civil society colleagues are angry. They're angry that South African business will not take on the big social and economic issues that they're advocating for. That if it's sort of fluffy and about active citizenship, businesses are prepared to support and engage. If it's about edgy human rights abuses, challenging and changing the system, not enough businesses are prepared to get involved at that end. And so we have a different set of challenges. And so to me, I suppose the sort of overriding question that I'm looking forward to sort of having answered over the next couple of days is, where are these interchanges most productive? And what shape do they take? What's the form that will follow the function? And how do we make sure that at each of these different types of interfaces, the relationship between business and civil society is as effective as it can be?
Thank you, Danny. Let me now start our discussion. I think we have heard really the broad picture, and I think the problematic has been set quite well by what we have heard so far. So now it is for you to take the floor. So who wants to start the discussion? Please. You will have the mic.
Well, thank you. Marcello Palazzi from the Netherlands. I just wanted to add one dimension that interested me a lot in the last few months. There are big companies like IBM that say, we are a social organization. There's a software company in California, Salesforce.com, that launched this idea that every business is social. So I think what's also happening, and I am actually working with an old school friend who runs a business in the UK with 40,000 employees. And the objective is, how do we actually tap the energy and the resources of all the people who work for the company on issues that the employees care about? So I think this is also a very new development to add to all the perspective that you have put on the agenda, that in fact businesses are social forces. And there is a real potential there with social media and other tools to actually rally the energy of all the employees, because these employees are also part of civil society. So it's actually blurring the space in a way even more than perhaps some of you have pointed out. Thank you.
Want to react to that, Serena?
Many big businesses were founded on the basis of having a strong sense of social purpose, and somewhere along the way, I think that's broken down. One example is Barclays was founded on Quaker principles of honesty, integrity, and fair dealing. And then when you look at how they've borne the brunt and been involved in so many scandals around mis-selling and rate fixing, etc. It's a pretty sad story. But now, taking the Barclays example, we have the new chief executive, Anthony Jenkins, who's undertaking a massive cultural change process and has taken the entire of his senior management team over to Africa and spent a week with civil society organizations trying to get them to reconnect with what's important in the world and what is the intersection between our interests. And definitely with social media, that really plays into the element of trust, and with Generation Y, it's more important than ever that they work for an organization that is doing the right thing and that's contributing to the world being a better place. So I absolutely agree, it's enormous potential. And I think the difference between whether companies can ignore these issues or not depends on whether they want to be successful in the long term. They can ignore them in the short term at their peril, but they have to work to restore trust. They have to secure access to scarce resources and get resilient supply chains. And they have to seize opportunities in new markets by working with civil society to innovate. So I think we can only be skeptical about business pursuing profit in the short term.
Yes, and we have seen quite a number of companies now which are allowing their personnel to take some percentage of their working time to do social work. In fact, this is becoming, and you are right to mention that this is becoming a kind of new trend.
Yeah. KPMG, we did a global people survey, and we found that 83% of our staff worldwide would welcome a clear opportunity to use their skills with civil society. So the evidence is absolutely there.
Next question here.
Sure. Thank you very much. I just wanted to follow up on Danny's point. My name is Sushant from the Skoll Center in Oxford. I really like your framework about from basic citizenship all the way to political change. But when I look at the relationship between business and NGOs or nonprofits or civil society, broadly speaking, the most unproductive phase is the advocacy phase, because to your point as well, social media has sort of become regulation 2.0, where government has failed to regulate. Social media fills that enormous vacuum. However, what social media and most activists fail to do is construct sensible business cases of why companies need to pivot and how they can pivot around this. So the relationship and the dynamic becomes one of compliance. Yes, we'll do a little bit less of this. However, the business model hasn't changed. The externalities that create the problem have not been internalized. There is no system that changes the entire relationship. And so I see a route around political change. I think both people need to meet at that threshold of where service provision leads to advocacy and try to create shared value business models. We need a lot of capacity around that, both from the business side of things, where they can understand where society is coming from and reframe the way value is created and things are accounted for, and capacity on the civil society side to think in the terms of value creation rather than just compliance, more or less. Thank you.
Can we go?
I don't know. There's, okay.
Okay.
Gustavo Montero, Rodrigo, you spoke about NGOs not being humbled. I fully agree with you. I spent years working for perhaps the largest NGO in the world, and I tell you that it is very, very true what's going on. They're not humble in their approach, in what they're doing, and what they're addressing many issues. I wonder if there's anybody, any party in this world addressing that issue specifically. How NGOs are interacting in the community out there.
Rodrigo?
One minute there. I agree with Serena, and the problem, if I could use that word, but the issues with civil society is that it's incredibly diverse. And you're expecting, if you produce that spectrum, that framework is very useful, that one you've provided. You have the very small church group at the local level and the huge NGO trying to do advocacy or change. So you have this widespread of things, and some of them, especially the small ones, are still very connected with the people they're serving. As you grow bigger, they tend to assimilate themselves to big business companies and start, sort of distancing themselves from what they're really doing. But I agree with you. We have the case in Chile. And we have the case that, a business, and very sincerely, they want to address these issues in a better way. They're human beings. They realize they're not doing it in a better way. So they associate themselves with an NGO in trying to seek for that help in doing the correct purpose for that human being, for what Christopher was about, bringing the human into the center of what we do. But this NGO is as far away from that human being as that business, So sometimes it's difficult.
Is there anything being done about it?
Not that I know.
Please, Professor Michel first, and Danny.
Thank you very much. Well, based on the experience I was given to make with NGOs, I had really absolutely excellent experiences, but some were more problematic. And I think that there are issues that need to be solved in the relationship between business and NGOs, as well as we had and we still have to solve in the relationship between states or intergovernmental organizations and NGOs and civil society. Let me mention three of them. The issue of legitimacy. A government or governmental representatives are supposed to have a democratic legitimization if they have been elected in a proper way, etc. But there is a basis for the legitimacy. Now, I understand that there are other ways for civil society members to be legitimate. For instance, the legitimacy of the purpose, the competence, the responsible behavior, etc. So, but one element is important: legitimacy. Second, transparency. Sometimes people are behind NGOs of whom you don't know who they are, who does fund the NGO and for what purpose. And commensurate to the role of these organizations, there is a need for transparency. Third, accountability. When you gave examples here of companies that were ruined after various activities by NGOs, but it might be that an NGO does something in a way that is wrong, simply. And how are they made accountable for what they have done? So, as a conclusion, I would just simply mention at the international level the need for a better organization of the cooperation between civil society and the intergovernmental organizations. What you have is the status of consultative organizations with ECOSOC, for instance. But there you have a number of very, very different types of organizations. And in the past, at the end of the 19th century or 20th century, when the main issue was the relationship between capital and labor in certain countries, institutions like economic and social councils were created. But now the need is not only about this bilateral relationship, but the relationship with a number of other organizations. And there is no institution to correspond to the need of a proper organization of the relationship. So if ECOSOC at the international level, the UN level, is not capable of organizing this cooperation, I think that a new institution should be built in order to somehow put the cooperation of the civil society on its right track as compared to the role of states and state representatives. There is no reason or legitimacy for civil society to replace the state. They have to play their specific role, both in an adjusted way.
Danny?
Just two quick points. One, to say that there is some work being done on the accountability of NGOs. So Civicus co-founded something called the International NGO Accountability Charter, which is a set of principles that now I think about a dozen big global NGOs have signed up to. But we do a lot of work on learning transparency and accountability, because I think civil society actors recognize these challenges, because if they can't walk the talk on on being about beneficiaries and the values that they are allegedly about, then the whole credibility sort of falls. And consumers, beneficiaries, others, and social media activists will see through that just as quickly as they will see through an empty corporate brand that doesn't live up to its brand. So I think there is a growing recognition that this is important. The second quick observation is related to your point, is one of my frustrations here is that we are stuck, generally speaking, with such outdated categories by which we classify the organizations that we're talking about. We have, corporates, with profit making. We have registered charities or not-for-profits, but which are the legacies of a bureaucracy or a bureaucratic model of thinking, which are completely irrelevant for many organizations which are becoming hybrid and in their nature. And we're starting to see in some countries the emergence of these new models of incorporation. So B corporations in the US is a good example, or community interest organizations in the UK. But I almost wish that we could sort of start afresh with how different organizations want to categorize themselves and have a slightly bigger menu of options than the very limited ones that we have at the moment.
Thank you. Just one question, Danny. Is Civicus, for instance, transparent about its funding?
Yes. We're so transparent. I'm so scared about this as a new incoming CEO that we publish our board minutes online.
Okay.
We try. It's a bit scary. I haven't had the guts to publish my first board minutes yet, but wait for it.
Serena?
Yeah, can I just add, there's also HAP, the Humanitarian Accountability Partnership, which is also doing work in the same area. I think increasingly people are looking at outcomes for people living in poverty. KPMG does the evaluations for the UK's Independent Commission for Aid Impact, and when we look at value for money, we absolutely look at how poor people, for instance, have been involved in a decision-making process. I think where there's more of a risk is with some of these great global initiatives that are dreamt up at WEF and similar forums, where then it doesn't go back to reconnect to people involved in decision-making. If they're not involved up front, then there's kind of an assumption that the objectives and the activities are the best route to go down.
I agree. Bettina?
Bettina Ferdman from Filias. I just wanted to add one or two comments. One of the things that we observe for the past 4 or 5 years is that there is clearly a change in the mindset of the business, because they are seeing also a number of NGOs as experts. So they use NGOs as experts. And this is new, and this is certainly one very interesting moving about concretely how you are going to develop partnership if you take expertise from the NGOs themselves. And the other way around, we see that NGOs, they need to professionalize themselves more, they need to have management skills and so on. So you see also skills transfer from the business to the NGOs, and even more, you see people having their career in the private sector for many years going into the NGO so-called world. So I think that in the future, clearly there will be changes, because professionals are now moving from, in a way, one sector to another sector. So this was one comment, and I believe this is very positive for the future. Another comment that I wanted to make was on the social media. And within the business-driven network of Filias, we did one day on social media and corporate citizenship, and how do companies handle their corporate citizenship strategy linked to social media, and how do they react to NGOs, campaign advocacy, and so on. And what we have observed is that on one hand, you have the NGOs that basically social media is a great tool because they campaign, they advocacy, and it's very clear and in a way very easy. On the company side, at least you have 3 levels. You have the level of the social media for products, especially when it's consumer goods. You have the social media as institutional door to communicate. And last but certainly not least, you have the social media that is used by the employees as citizens. And so there, I think we are really just at the beginning of how companies are able to understand and how they use the social media, and in front having numerous of NGOs that obviously have a strategy, but a much more easier strategy than the business sector. So I think this is also something we should think in the future. And last but not least, when we are talking about civil society, who are we talking about? And if we are talking about individuals or human beings, so we are also talking about employees within companies. And one of the tools that we see that is more and more used by companies is corporate volunteering, because this is a tool whereby you can involve all employees within a company on a voluntary basis. They will be in contact with the NGOs. They will understand what Rodrigo was saying, that beneficiaries or NGOs have resources, different way of thinking, and there you are really in a position to create not only a conscious, but also linking the value of the individual, the company, and really create action for act. That was my different comment. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to go here first to the lady here, and then I will come to you, sir. The lady in red here.
No, just one quick comment. I think somebody referred to this. You know, we're still talking in terms of NGOs and businesses, you know, these old models. And just like people, you have the good ones, the bad ones, the serious ones, and the not so serious ones. One issue that also worries me, I think was mentioned, is where governments are stepping out, expecting NGOs to pick up. And there are many NGOs that are being created just for that, you know, to funnel resources, but not necessarily to deliver the services. And I think this is something that this accountability initiative would be very important for. I have one example, for example, in the Brazilian Amazon, there were NGOs created to deliver health services to indigenous peoples, and the services were not there, you know. But I think the point that I wanted to make for businesses is that, you know, to spend more time, not look for the quick solution in terms of which NGO to associate with, just to say that you're doing, that you're reaching out to civil society. Do the groundwork to actually see, you know, who, how this NGO is related to actual results on the ground, the small ones. It takes more work. It's easier for a big business to associate with a well-known NGO that has a reputation, but I mean, I would suggest that you take more time to really see how that institution will be able to deliver the results that you're looking for.
Thank you. Rodrigo, you wanted first to have a quick comment, and then we go to the gentleman here.
Thank you, Claude. I just want to comment on Bettina's comment that we need to be very careful. I'm not against it, and we need to be very careful to transfer those business people into NGOs. Sometimes, you know, they move on and they want to install in that NGO the good and the not so good practices they are bringing from their business background. You see, you sometimes you want a well management, you want results, you want to manage your Excels and everything. But some of those things so again, I'm advocating this point about unconscious arrogance, because I was running this huge business that was so successful. I'm going to teach you NGOs how to run an organization. I'm not saying you suggested that. I'm saying just you need to be careful with this, because you need to change your mind frame to work in an NGO. Again, within this wide variety of NGOs. But I entirely agree with you that because of accountability of many of the NGOs and their efficiency and their value creation are not that good, you need to bring in some of the good business practices that we have in business, but not just transfer the total of them into the NGOs. There is a little bit of care that you need to do with that process.
Can I just make one exception to that? There's good evidence to suggest, worrying evidence to suggest, that the one transfer that seems to work well is when women come from business into NGOs. We did a survey of the big CEOs of NGOs. Almost all of them have come from outside the sector because civil society doesn't seem to be particularly good at growing its own leaders, whereas many women in senior business positions seem frustrated about the glass ceiling in business, so they make the leap. So that was the one exception to your very valid point about not wanting to import too much.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 more questions because we are beginning to run out of time. So I will go first to you, sir, because you have been waiting for some time, and then I will go to you. Sir.
Carlos Prima Braga, professor, IMD and director of the AVM Group. My question is to Danny. I found quite interesting your analysis and particularly the point that you make that governments are withdrawing and civil society, the private sector, filling this void. In reality, this is nothing new in developing countries. Actually, we see the private sector investing in infrastructure that otherwise, in an industrialized country, it would be provided by the public sector. We see civil society very active, for instance, in health services, sanitation, etc. Now, my question is, and it may be a little bit like asking what Winnie the Pooh and Alexander the Great have in common, besides the same middle name. But my question is, do you think that based in Civica's experience, and particularly with the NGOs in the South, now that we see the public sector withdrawing in OECD countries, particularly in Europe, there are important lessons from the South to the North on how to organize this interaction?
Yes, I do think that there are lessons. I think the question, I mean, although the fundamental processes at work in the North and the South, if I can use that language, seem to be different. If I could use an example from the North, from personal experience, today is World Refugee Day, so I sit on the board of a refugee organisation in the UK, which the most difficult board discussion we ever had in my time on the board was about whether we went in with a big private group to deliver employment services for refugees. And the reason we had a very difficult discussion was the state, which had hitherto been providing its own employment training services, decided it couldn't do it as well, so it contracted out. It contracted out to big corporates. Big corporates needed specialists to do it. We're sitting here going, oh my gosh, how do we deal with this chain? And the lessons there, in terms of my own experience, was the state wasn't really particularly well sort of versed in how to do this privatization in this area. The big corporates didn't have really a lot of ground experience in working together with the NGOs, and the NGOs just had no idea. And so maybe the lesson from the global South is, as you rightly say, for better or for worse, this has been happening in some of these countries because the state just hasn't been able to provide those services. And if you look across, say, the African continent, there are some really interesting good practice examples in the telecom sector, in the healthcare sector, where there are some creative partnerships, which are also using technology in amazing ways that we're yet to sort of capture in the sort of global north. So, yes, Winnie and Alexander need to talk.
Question here.
Thank you. A really great start to the day, and already so many questions that are coming out of this. I'm Stuart Orr from WWF International, and as somebody coming from an NGO, I think to your point, Danny, about accountability, it's absolutely crucial that we are held more accountable for our work. And I think the same nervousness you face about putting things up in the public domain, we do too. I think it's worth this audience understanding that there's a lot of fratricide within the NGO community. We get it in the neck all the time from NGOs, particularly because we work closely with business. They think we've sold out. We think we've gone the wrong way. I can talk about that later today, but fundamentally it's us engaging power because we feel that's the only way we're going to get somewhere. But there's a real interesting understanding about that community of NGOs. It gets to your point, Rodrigo, that the NGO that the company picked was as irrelevant as maybe the company was, I would suggest you pick the wrong NGO. So I think part of the question here, maybe the question I have for Serena is, as you're talking to companies, how do you get them to be more strategic about the NGOs they pick? Because as some people have said here, they're looking to them as experts or to give them the business case. But I go to talk to a company sometimes and they have 200 NGO relationships. I mean, this is just looking to create relationships to buffer the brand. That's not creating a partnership of winners. How does that shift?
Serena.
I think there can be an assumption from big business that big NGOs are effective in what they do. KPMG has an advantage because commercially we do lots of evaluations of NGOs' work, so we feel that we have good understanding to develop global relationships with ones that we know are effective. And there's always going to be a tension between partnering with large NGOs so that we can get synergies and global scale, and the fact that investing in a partnership takes so much time that you don't want to have 200 relationships. However, like many big companies, we're not one organization, we're a network of member firms. And so we work in 150 countries, and we have to respect that we want our local officers to buy into our global relationships, but they also have autonomy to choose which local organizations they feel an association with and are particularly impactful. So I think it is challenging. There's not a quick and easy answer. But I think also when we're looking at which NGOs we work with, we need to think about, in the context of accountability, how complicated the relationships are getting. So on the one hand, you can be giving an NGO cash funding, you can be partnering with them collaboratively, you can be on the receiving end of a campaign to keep in check what you're doing. There are a couple of big NGOs that also have roles on boards of FTSE 100 companies in the UK, and there's questions over whether that would be a better route to go down. And then you have people who have been transferred recently from big business. So how do you make sure you're independent and keep that all in check?
Any last comment from the... Please,
Yes.
Marlene.
I just want to add to Danny's spectrum, because I think it's brilliant. There is also another dimension. If the spectrum goes like this, there's this dimension which is the developed countries and the underdeveloped countries, or the North and the South, whatever you want to call it. Because we've had in Egypt, and I'll say that very quickly, one attempt at having business involved in NGO work, and it was an initiative which was brilliant. The problem with it is that it's okay if they work in service, it's okay if they work in specific things, but it wasn't okay if they got involved in, for example, issues of democracy, human rights, etc. And the businesses were affected. The businesses, the government actually cracked down on these businesses. So there is this, there's a setback, and the initiative fell apart. I think that's why my talk was mainly about how the West was dealing with, how these companies dealt with NGOs in Egypt, or with civil society in the Middle East, or in any country that is non-democratic. So it's, I don't know, just, yeah.
Muddy waters.
It's a tough one. I mean, the problem is that some people ask for, yes, accountability and transparency and all of that. A lot of us cannot be transparent in these countries, because if we are transparent, there is, you know, that's why they keep cracking down on our organizations and on the NGO laws. Egypt now, even after Mubarak, of course it's in a worse situation right now, they've put in an NGO law that is extremely much worse than the one that was before it.
Same case in Russia.
In a lot of countries, and Egypt is just one very, very simple example, because it's in transition, but the transition is not very good. And so asking us for transparency, yes, to what extent can we be transparent? So they want, for example, they can go in, according to this new law, they can go into a torture an organization that deals with rehabilitation of torture and get all their files, in which case all these people who gave their testimonies, they have access to these, they have access to the funding, and they will stop it, like they stopped many people. And perhaps one issue that came out of this is 43 individuals right now, just a couple of weeks ago, have been arrested from international organizations as well. And they got prison sentences, so some of whom are American. So it's transparency, yes, I can see it, but not in all cases, which is why I put that other dimension of up and down as well.
Thank you. I think we are coming to a close for this opening session, but of course some of the themes that have been discussing will come back during the next 2 days, and of course you are with us and we can continue the discussion in different forms. I will not try to summarize what has been said so far, but let me try to highlight some points that I took from the discussion. First of all, as Serena said, we have today a civil society which is diverse, which is vibrant, which is very influential. So, in one word, it has become impossible to ignore the clout, power, influence that this new player represent. At the same time, we see that business and NGOs are more and more engaging in what is being called co-creation. And in fact, during our lunch, we will be devoting the discussion to this notion of co-creation. But what we see is how this collaboration is today taking a number of forms, not only at the national, but at the international level, with some global initiatives which are taking place. Now, at the same time, we realize that this relationship is not necessarily an easy one. It is at least a very complex one. And the key elements for the, if you want, the rules of engagement which have been highlighted are, of course, points that have been made about transparency, about ensuring the legitimacy of a NGO, the accountability, and in a way, the clarity about the purpose. I think these are very, very key starting point with respect to the relationship. At the same time, when I speak about a complex relationship, we have seen from the discussions that, in a way, the boundaries between NGOs and business are not anymore that clear, that we see a number of blurring of a line, a number of examples of blurring of a line, and we see also that, in a way, we have new forms of organization, new forms of incorporation reflecting the hybrid nature that sometimes this element of NGO mission, business mission, in a way come together and become a little bit blurred. Another element which I think is very important because we don't speak enough about it is, as Rodrigo mentioned, to move from unconscious arrogance to a very conscious humility about what we know, whether it is NGO, whether it is business, how we can do things, and what, in fact, the other party might know better than we do, wherever the place, whatever the place we have. And this notion, many of you have mentioned that, of building trust. And we have understood that building trust is not a kind of overnight thing. It is a long process. It requires patience. Now, One other important thing that I would like to take from the discussion is that we have this new role of the social media, and in a way, this new role of the social media, while enhancing the power and clout of civil society, is at the same time, or can be, a double-edged sword. But one key element that I think Marlene has illustrated in a very eloquent way is that with social media, business, but I would say also government, has no other choice, you said, than to be ethical. I would say at least than to be more ethical in its purpose and in its modus operandi. I think another point is the need for greater clarity on where and when the collaboration between NGOs and business can be the most effective. I think this is a point that Danny has emphasized, and this is a point, in my view, which becomes more crucial as the state is withdrawing from some activities which were before really the exclusive territory of the state, and in some cases now the provision of social services. And even in China today, despite the great suspicion, if not more, of the government toward NGOs, we see some experiments where the state is in a way delegating the provision of some social services or accepting a complementary role in the provision of social services to civil society organizations. I think this is a very interesting new phenomenon. Last but not least, I think a very important point, which was the point you highlight, Professor Michel, about the need for a better organization of a cooperation between the two. I think the example of ECOSOC that you mentioned, which was at the beginning a kind of platform for cooperation between unions and business, we need to see what kind of structure can be this kind of platform for a better structuring, organization, rules of engagement between these new key players which are today becoming indispensable when addressing many issues. I will stop here. I will remind you that after this meeting, in the, say, 2 or 3 weeks after the meeting, all of you will receive an executive summary of all the discussions that will be held in these 2 days of the Zermatt Summit. But I would like to close by asking you really to thank our panelists for this very insightful start for our discussion. Thank you.